So I was listening to Frantz Fanon's "The Wretched of the Earth," and something that really like kind of struck me was in the section about violence, about political violence. And it's really interesting how sort of the mentality of people like myself who are educated in the theory of Marxism, liberation theology, liberatory studies, right? Like, don't necessarily have like an in with the people in rural areas, mostly because we're in cities. Like we tend to be stationed in cities. We tend to, like, you can see in places like New York, where they just elected Zoran, the places where socialist movements, especially democratic socialist movements, tend to take hold are larger cities, even though the people who would benefit equally from those socialist movements live out in rural areas. And, like, outside of like racism and stuff like that, one of the reasons that it's hard to do that cross promoting, I guess, is a weird way to put it, but it's twofold. Within those communities, there is a vested interest in the leadership of those communities who operate under the colonial rule. Like, they have more to lose than the poor people who are actually like living and working in those communities, right? So the people who are like in charge of the churches, the people who are in charge of the government, the people who are kind of living middle to upper class like lives out in those rural areas have a vested interest in not shaking up the political structure of the area out there. They operate as agents of the colonial power in order to kind of prevent popular uprising. And secondarily, in the same way, you also have a bias externally from people like myself who are educated in theory, who have, like, gone to school, live in cities. There's a deep distrust that goes both ways. The imperial core in the cities tend to look down on people in the rural areas, and vice versa. The people in the rural areas tend to look down on people in the cities for the same but opposite reason. People in the imperial core look down on people in the rural areas because of their education and the sort of like tribalistic nature of like living a more serf-esque like life. Like, most people who operate in rural areas live off the land to in some regard. You know, there's a reason that like country music is always about like like farms and tractors and stuff. The Bo Burnham song "Pandering," right? That kind of like talks about like how all of these like rich musicians talk about uh rural life as if either they came from it or they live in it now. When they live in mansions, there's a distinct lack of understanding that comes from the cities of the needs and desires of the rural area, and there's a distinct lack of care or trust from the rural areas of people who come from the cities. And I think, like, I was listening to his like explanation about some of this stuff, and I was like, this really makes sense. Like, the reason why when Confederate statues were being taken down, you saw this pushback outside of like just blatant racism, is that like these are the heroes of the South, right? Like, so when you go into southern rural areas and you see like these Confederate statues that were placed well after the Civil War, you know what I mean? Specifically by the Klan and the Daughters of the Confederacy and people like that, who actively like wanted to terrorize those communities, to their descendants, to like their kids and their grandkids. Well, they are active symbols of racism, but like they don't always like for the ones who aren't like true believers, they don't picture them like that. They just see them as the heroes of the past, right? This is what Fanon was talking about in that chapter, sort of about how like when popular rebellions spring up in rural areas, the people in the cities look at them as like, oh, good, people are rising up, but they don't actually like do anything to participate. They don't go in and like teach people theory. They don't help in any like tangible way. They just kind of watch it from afar. And I think that has a lot to do with why the populist movement in America kicked off in like this racist, xenophobic, Confederate Nazi-esque way, as opposed to being a radical, like a populist leftist movement. Is because like outside of like the decades of like propaganda against like socialism and communism specifically in America, um, a lot of it I think has to do with this idea that like people outside of the cities are backwards, and then the rural idea that people in the cities are elitist and untrustworthy, right? And those are seeds that are planted by the colonial power, by the ruling class, by the elite, by the state, to prevent solidarity. Um, so yeah, I think I mean, I always think that we should have read Fanon more, but like really reading The Wretched of the Earth again has really got me into like we should have read Fanon more. Like one of our problems on the left is that like not that like we don't read the stuff, but we don't apply it practically, and we don't teach people what it means. So like we read Fanon, and when Fanon says that, we're like, yeah, that works in the imperial core, and we don't apply it to the imperial core of the modern era, which is the United States, because we don't think of ourselves as colonized, unless you're in like liberation spaces, unless you're listening to black people who've been saying it for decades. But we don't think of ourselves necessarily as colonized. We think of ourselves as, you know, citizens. We don't think of ourselves as colonial subjects, even though we have a centralized government. America is so big that it is impossible to truly centralize in a way that is uniform, which is why, you know, when Fanon talks about regionalization instead of nationalization, um, I think that's one of the things that is really important out of Fanon's work that we kind of ignored uh, coming into 2016, and then like, you know, now, is that like stuff is so regionalized in the States because the country is so big. So if you operate from the perspective that America is in and of itself a colony, right? Like imagine that like DC is the imperial core of the motherland, right? In Fanon's terms. And then think about every state as a piece of the empire. And I think you have a better understanding of why we regionalize in the way that we do, and why it's so difficult to form solidarity between regions and between like cities and rural areas and stuff. And it's because we don't think of ourselves as part of the empire. Places where it's obvious, like Hawaii, like Puerto Rico, like Alaska, you know what I mean, that are distant from the states proper, where like the further out you get from the imperial core, like the less rights you have as an American, right? To the point where like we don't even think about like people are mad that Bad Bunny is performing at the Super Bowl because they don't think he's an American, but he's Puerto Rican. Like that's crazy. It's interesting to me. I have to think about this a little bit more, and like maybe I'll have like a more cohesive uh thought about it that I can make into a shorter, like quippier video that like will actually help people. But like I just needed to get that out of my head. It's really interesting how prescient Fanon is still thinking about like imperialism and the way that it affects people within the imperial core and in the colonies. Um yeah, interesting.